Thank you very much, Kaveh. So today I'm presenting on how to enhance digital collaboration across the business. And for this, we're mostly focused on how to work with users and roles and understand how they can work together to make the most out of your enterprise architecture. So our agenda today is to start out by introducing some users. We're going to start out with some user types that can kind of represent the types of people that you might be needing to create roles for in Abacus that are going to be working tangentially or directly with enterprise architecture. And then we're going to jump into an overview of licenses, feature permissions, and model create, read, update, delete permissions so that we can understand the landscape that we're working with. And then we'll go through the steps of setting up each user's profile. So we'll see at a high level what types of licenses, feature permissions, and model CRUD permissions each of those users would need to give you an idea of how you might need to go ahead and set up your users and enable the types of roles that are needed at your organization. So with that, let's get started with our users. So here we have a few profiles that we'll talk about in order to understand how they fit into the realm of Abacus. So first we have Eric, the enterprise architect. He needs to be able to configure the meta model, work with syncing data from other sources, do analysis, compare architectures, and so on. Then we have Sam, the solution architect, and he needs to be able to draw solution architecture diagrams, which we know can be quite complex and can involve a lot of things, including taking existing content, existing relationships that might exist in the repository and leveraging them, as well as adding in some kind of diagram extras. Then we have Beatrice, the business architect, and she's mostly focused on process modeling. So she needs to be able to create process models and will need tool access for doing that. Then we have Aaron, the architecture review board approver. So he is reviewing and approving solutions and also contributing data and information about projects and strategic initiatives and so on. So he's going to need some editing capabilities for doing that. And that might include editing something that appears in a diagram. Then we have Desiree, the decision maker. She's not necessarily contributing data, but she needs to be able to see things in detail. So understand enough information to make decisions around finances and risks and other factors. And then there's Callie, the curious, and she's not directly involved in anything with enterprise architecture, but might be tangentially involved and wants to be able to learn a little bit more and also see what's happening in the realm of enterprise architecture. So we're going to learn what types of licenses, feature permissions, and create, read, update, delete permissions we would need to set up for each of these users to make them successful. And so we're going to answer the following questions. Which license does each user need? Which feature permissions are needed? Which model CRUD permissions? And then, of course, what steps to get that set up. But before we can answer these questions, we first need to provide an overview. So many of you are likely familiar with this tree slide, and this is just meant to represent how we have both enterprise, which is branching out into the enterprise, which allows us to have co-authoring in catalogs, diagram building, and interactive dashboards with rich dynamic visualizations. And this works with the collaboration server to work with Studio, and Studio is the side where we might have some more in-depth work. This does include setting up permissions, meta modeling, viewpoints, as well as some diagramming. And the key thing is, of course, both Enterprise and Studio are working off of the same underlying repository, so it's the same underlying data, and that is key to keep in mind. So this is another way of visualizing it, just to kind of have that mental image in your head of what is in Enterprise and what is in Studio. So again, same repository underneath in Enterprise. We're seeing how we have those catalogs, those diagrams, but also those nice visualizations in the dashboard. And in Studio, of course, again, we still have those diagrams, we still have those catalogs, but then we can also extend into other areas such as meta model configuration, as well as some of the things we're seeing here with syncing with other sources of data and setting up analysis. Now, this connection between enterprise and studio is also really key to understand when we're talking about users and access. So all users who access enterprise are users that appear under managed users and groups in Studio. It's actually impossible for there to be a user accessing enterprise that is not a user under here in managed users and groups in Studio. So when we look at the list of users under managed users and groups, that is not a reflection of the Studio users that we have, but rather that is a reflection of everyone who is accessing Abacus in any way, including as just a viewer in enterprise. Now here we're showing this as someone who might be logging in and accessing enterprise that way. But this also applies when we're working with single sign-on. So with single sign-on, that means that we have a connection to an identity manager. And so users are logging into enterprise with single sign-on. And in that case, they are still going to be users that appear under managed users and groups in Studio. And single sign-on helps them not have to remember another password. They can just access the site and be logged in automatically. But again, that user that they're set up as for that profile in enterprise, that is still a user that is reflected under managed users and groups in Studio. And this is even true when we set up auto provisioning. So with single sign-on, we can set up auto provisioning where if a user is a valid user of enterprise according to your identity manager, then the first time that they access the enterprise site, they will be logged in automatically and automatically added in Abacus Studio under managed users and groups. And if we set it up, they'll be also added to a default group. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to set up that understanding now that even when we're talking about auto provisioning and enabling that very wide access, we still have control over these users, and that control is still partially happening under managed users and groups. So with that level of understanding, let's get into an understanding of licenses and accounts. And of course, this part matters because this is where the cost comes in. So this is where we're talking about the per user cost and what implications there are depending on what type of user we are setting them up as. So first, let's talk about this for Studio. So with Studio, we have named users. So in Studio, each user is identified specifically, and that is communicated to us here at Avolution. So if you have cloud for Studio, then Avolution creates that cloud account. But if you have SIG clients, then Avolution still needs the name of those users, but we provide license keys and the installer for downloading. So either way, named users and requiring contact with Avolution. In enterprise, it works a little bit differently. So the enterprise viewers that we have, these are actually unlimited. Now, these might be auto-provisioned, as we discussed, or they can be set up manually, creating that user and login. And that would be done by the Abacus administrator. So this isn't really something that you have to have contact with Avolution to have them set up. And it's sort of an extension of this when we're talking about editors as well as modelers. So with enterprise editors and enterprise modelers, we have a maximum count. So you might have, say, 20 editors and 5 modelers that you've purchased. These are not named users, so you don't have to specify to Avolution who these are. Rather, the Abacus administrator needs to find that user profile in managed users and groups and assign them to editors and modelers. So they're named in that you're specifying who can use them, but it's something that is fully within your control, assigned by the Abacus administrator. It's not something that Avolution needs to explicitly assign. Beyond licenses and accounts, we can also get into feature permissions. So feature permissions takes us beyond just what that licensed access is and can add additional features to that. And also feature permissions is how we work with those assigned licenses such as editor and modeler, where we're just kind of subtracting from that number that we have of those. So on the studio side, it's important to understand the baseline. So the baseline with studio is just what we refer to as a standard studio user. This is anyone who has studio. So they have studio because they have a license or they have a cloud account. And as a result, they have access to updating the model through diagramming, catalogs, importing data, and more. So that's what they have just kind of as a baseline because they have access to Studio. But on top of that, we can add additional feature permissions, such as configurer, where they can configure the model or the meta model, administrator, where they can set up users and permissions, simulators and algorithm composer, SharePoint, Technopedia, ServiceNow sync. These are all additional features that can be enabled, as well as architecture sync and script editor. So these are all features that we can add onto a studio user. On the Abacus Enterprise side, what we can think of as kind of the baseline for this is being viewers, those like read-only users that are able to still interact with and view enterprise dashboards and visualizations. And all Abacus packages include unlimited read-only users. But then we can take those enterprise users and we can add on to what they're able to do. So this includes making someone an enterprise editor. And of course, then we're taking one out of that maximum number of editors that we can enable. Same thing with enterprise modeler. Now with editor, that's where they're going to be able to edit in catalogs. Modeler, that is where they're going to be able to edit in catalogs and other places, as well as work in diagrams. And we also have configurer. Now configurer, that is the same as what we see with configurer for Abacus Studio users. So these are generally going to be the same people. It's actually the same feature permission that is enabled. And it just means that by enabling configurer for that user, they're going to be able to also configure dashboards in enterprise, setting up portlets and so on. And we have administrator, and that's mostly doing things like setting up SSO in enterprise. Those are the types of things that are enabled. So we've gone over licenses, we've gone over feature permissions at this high level, and now we'll get into model, create, read, update, delete permissions. And again, we're just doing a kind of broad overview so that you have this basic understanding before we get into the individual users and some more specific examples here. So for the model CRUD permissions, the baseline is full access. So we start out with groups having full access to model content, and then permissions are used to restrict different aspects. So we can remove access to enterprise dashboards or to the enterprise browser view. And this is actually set in enterprise. We can also remove access to things like component types and connection types. Now, by doing that, by reducing the create, read, update, or delete permissions on a component or connection type, that's going to carry through to all of the components of that type or all of the connections of that type. We can also restrict access to things like properties, as well as viewpoints. Now with viewpoints, again, that can carry over to diagrams, and that can also impact whether a user in a group is able to create a diagram of a viewpoint or not. This also carries through to architectures. We can set these permissions on architectures as well as on individual diagrams, catalogs, and matrices. And all of these more granular permissions are set in Studio. However, they do carry over to enterprise, and they will impact users in enterprise if any of these are restricted in Studio for that user based on the groups that they are in. So let's go through a few key reminders. So first, feature permissions and model CRUD permissions are added to groups, not to individual users. We're going to be talking about it a lot in terms of individual users and what they need to be added to, or what permissions they will have. But keep in mind, we're always adding these permissions to groups. We're not able to add them to individual users. We're always adding them to groups. Next, feature permissions are additive. So a user in multiple feature permissions groups will have all the feature permissions from all the groups. So for example, If you have a user who is in the configurer feature permission group where configurer is enabled, and they're also in another group that does not enable configurer, they will still have configurer enabled for them. In the same way, if they are in, let's say, the configurer group and in a group that does not have any feature permissions enabled, and in a group that enables Technopedia Sync, they will have configurer and Technopedia Sync feature permissions enabled for them. Now, this is in contrast to the way that model CRUD permissions work, which is that they are pessimistic. And so a user in multiple model CRUD permissions groups will have the restrictions from all the groups. So if a user or if we have a group A, which restricts access to dashboard A, and a group B, which restricts access to dashboard B, then a user in group A, they will have access to dashboard B. The user in group B, they will have access to dashboard A, but a user that is in both groups will not have access to either. So we have to be really careful about adding users to multiple groups, because as we add them to more groups, we are just restricting them further. So we need to keep that in mind and note that sometimes we need to actually remove users from groups in order to provide them with more access. There are a couple of best practices to keep in mind as well. I'm not going into a lot of detail with the best practices. There are certainly more that we could add in here, but there are a couple that I particularly would like you to keep in mind as we work through this. So one is that we generally want to add feature permissions to groups that are distinct from model CRUD groups. So we have some groups that are set up for setting up those model create, read, update, delete permissions, and different groups that are set up to enable certain feature permissions. And this generally is going to shuffle out to be one feature permission per group so that we can be really specific in what we are enabling for our users. Another good practice is to try the out-of-the-box permissions in the Avolution framework. These can save you some time. However, they might not be exactly aligned to your needs, and you do want to make sure that you're not using them just based off of the names of the groups, because that may lead to some surprises about what permissions restrictions you're actually putting on your users. And so it's a good idea to run the permissions report script to see whether these groups can be a starting group for setting permissions for your users. So with that, we're now going to get into setting up access for the user profiles that we went over at the beginning. And we're going to start out by going through who's going to be set up as enterprise viewers. So with enterprise viewers, these people are able to filter in dashboards, search in enterprise, save and share filtered views, and even submit feedback. So even though they are not data editors in any way, they still have a lot of access to the tool. And so the first person that our first user profile that we're setting up as an enterprise viewer is Callie the Curious. So as we established before, she's tangentially related to several IT initiatives and keen to learn more about them, but she doesn't have a specific reason to be accessing Abacus Enterprise. And for users like this that might just be kind of happening upon enterprise, or maybe we want to send them an occasional diagram or something like that, this is where auto provisioning really plays a key role. So to set up auto provisioning, you need to enable auto provisioning in Abacus Studio under Manage Users and Groups. And that's simply by checking the box to create externally authenticated users automatically. Then in Abacus Enterprise, single sign-on needs to be enabled. And we can also set a group, or actually multiple groups, as a default group. With this setup, and of course, with single sign-on, that does require you to set that up in your identity manager as well. But with this setup, a user can simply access Abacus Enterprise. They will be auto provisioned, added as a user, and their user will automatically go into this default group. And so this is a great option for someone who will be casually happening upon this, as Callie might be. Now with that default group, that is only going to be useful for us if we set up default permissions on it. And I will just note, we don't have to literally call it default group. We have that set default button there, and we can put that on any group. And again, it can be multiple groups, meaning that the user would be added into all groups that are set as default. So we can set up some permissions on that default group. Some things that I generally find helpful for this and would be useful for someone like Callie would be one, to remove browser permissions. And this is going to restrict default group users to views that are in dashboards. So they're only seeing those more curated views. Now, you do have to be careful about the limitations that this puts on you. You're not able to then go to a specific diagram and share that link. And they're going to be more limited in navigating the tool. But that's something that you might want for someone who is just being auto-provisioned, who may or may not need to be seeing everything that is in ABACUS. You can also consider removing permissions to specific dashboards to limit auto-provision users to only a few dashboards that you know you want them to see. And of course, in ABACUS Studio, you can also take this further and remove other permissions from the default group. For example, you may want to consider removing permissions to read something like a target state architecture, where everything is not quite yet set in stone, and maybe not something that you want to expose more broadly. This could also carry over to doing things like restricting something like the financial properties or strategy components, so that people are not seeing that who should not be having that information. And so this results in Callie having access as a viewer. She can be auto-provisioned in, and then she's able to navigate through the model. Everything that's being shown here are things that read-only viewers can do, so they can still do all of this navigation through the tool. And of course, because we've set this up to only allow her to view dashboards that are appropriate, we have confidence that this is going to be information that we are happy to have out there. Next, we have Desiree, the decision maker. So she is also someone who is not actually contributing data, but she needs to be able to have more input for making more decisions. So she needs to be able to dig into what is in ABACUS a bit further, review financial risk and business fit information, as well as dig into diagrams and see more of that detail. And so while this user might be set up in the same way, so she might be initially auto-provisioned as a user, we now need to go back and make sure that her access is going to give her the right level of information that she needs. So this is going to mean removing her from the default group to get rid of the restrictions that are on the default group. And then we're going to need to reassign her to another group that is more appropriate. So in this case, perhaps putting her in that decision makers group. Now in that group, we can then set up permissions and access as needed. So for this group, we want to say enable viewing of the browser, and by enabling that, I just mean not restricting it. So we're not removing restrictions for the browser on this group, but we might still be removing permissions for certain dashboards that might just be a distraction to someone at the decision maker stakeholder type of level. And then we can send this to our user, or embed an enterprise into a location where they're already accessing it, such as in ABACUS Teams. I'm sorry, such as in Microsoft Teams. And so then our user is able to navigate through the dashboards that she should have access to. And because we've removed her from the default permissions group, that also means that she's going to have access to view things in browsers, such as this diagram here. And so she has a lot more options to work through the model and see more of that detail. Now let's get into who we can set up as enterprise editors. So enterprise editors have everything available to them that viewers have available to them to do, but they can also edit data in different places. This includes editing data in catalogs. That's actually where they have the most options available to them because catalogs are where they can also add and delete elements. But editors are actually also able to edit data on elements and diagrams, so they can open up a properties window where they can edit both properties and attachments. And this can also be opened from the details menu, which can be accessed in a wide range of views, including the Explorer tree. So the first user that we're going to set up as an editor is Aaron, the Architecture Review Board Approver. And so Aaron needs to approve content using properties on components and connections, and also he needs to add details on projects and IT strategies. Now, even though some of this work is going to be done in diagrams, he doesn't need to actually rearrange the content on a diagram. And so that's why editor is a good fit for this user. So we're going to set up access for Aaron. So he might be manually created as a user. We might actually manually enter in that user details, or the user profile might be created from auto provisioning. And then we need to then take that user and make sure we're removing the user from groups that it should not be in, such as default, and making sure that the user profile is in the groups that this user does need access to. So Aaron needs to be assigned to the editor group. He will be using one of those editor seats. So after assigning Aaron to the editor group, we now would go from, say, 20 editors that we can assign down to 19 because one has been assigned. And we need to assign him to permissions groups. So in this case, maybe none of the out-of-the-box groups work, or perhaps you're starting with a different framework. So we can create a brand new group. In this case, I'm just calling it ARB, and assign permissions to that group. And then we're going to assign those permissions. So this will be something like perhaps removing update permissions for properties or catalogs that we don't want ARB approvers to update. And removing create and delete permissions for certain component types. This can be especially a good idea if the maintenance of certain types is designated to certain groups or is actually coming from a separate source system. And so we want to make sure that our users are not messing with that data. And this is going to make it so that Aaron has access to the catalogs that are appropriate for him to edit. Keep in mind, we can put permissions on specific catalogs. And as an editor, he's still going to be able to create connections to other components, as we can see here. In this catalog, you could also add a brand new component as long as our create, read, update, delete permissions enabled. Actually, as a viewer, he can still go to a diagram as we see here and edit properties on a component in a diagram. He cannot actually edit the diagram and rearrange things, but he can still edit the content in that properties window. Now, this is not the only way to edit content as an editor. You can also open up that edit properties window from the details window from other places as well. Then we're going to look at who we can set up as an enterprise modeler. Now, enterprise modelers, they are able to do everything that enterprise viewers and enterprise editors can do, but they can also add and delete components and connections from diagrams and arrange content in diagrams. And so we're going to set up Beatrice as an enterprise modeler. Now she wants to build business process models that connect to existing capabilities and applications. However, we have established that her needs and requirements are not to do very, very complex diagrams. She doesn't need to query a lot of existing relationships or leverage a lot of freeform shapes or copy and paste diagrams. So this is going to be a good fit for her as an enterprise modeler. And so with this setup, of course, again, we have to set up the user. She might be created manually or through auto provisioning as her user. And then we need to assign her user to the modeler group. If she was set up using auto provisioning, also we need to make sure we're removing her user from the default groups and assigning to the appropriate permissions groups. So in this case, let's look at assigning her to the business analyst BAs 1 group. This is one of the out-of-the-box permissions groups that the Avolution framework provides. And we can actually see in these last images at the top right a portion of the exported permissions report, where we're actually able to go through and see what permissions are already assigned to this business analyst group. And in this case, we can actually see in this particular screenshot that most viewpoints are read-only. The only ones that have create, read, update, delete, all those full permissions for this group are the ones that are directly related to business architecture. And that is perfect for this user because these other viewpoints are set to read. She is still going to be able to see the diagrams that are of those viewpoints, but she's not going to be able to create a diagram using those viewpoints. And that's actually going to be perfect for making it easier for the enterprise modeler to create a diagram, knowing exactly which viewpoint to choose, because we're not providing so many different viewpoints as options. But of course, we might need to make some adjustments to that. So for example, we might need to go in this case, application is something that business analysts can still update and create. And we might not want to allow that. Perhaps that's coming in from ServiceNow or something like that. So we can go to that component type and remove those permissions for this group. And so then Beatrice is going to be able to work in diagrams in Enterprise. She'll be able to add brand new components to diagrams, edit their properties, of course, and connect things up in those diagrams. And this is also going to allow her to add existing components. So searching through lists of existing components and adding those to the diagram, even if, for example, we have made it so that she cannot create new applications, she can still add an existing application to the diagram. So we're protecting our data while still making sure that she has the access she needs for creating these diagrams. Next, we'll get into Studio users. So Studio users have access to Studio and they can work with data in diagrams and catalogs. And then we can also enable additional feature permissions for them. And so our first Studio user is Sam, the solution architect, and he needs to draw diagrams that leverage existing relationships, as well as utilizing freeform shapes for sort of diagram add-ons. He also might be copying and pasting template diagrams. There's a lot of complexity in this case in the types of diagrams that he is drawing. And so we want to make sure that he has access to the full range of diagramming options that we have available in Studio. And when we're providing Studio access to anyone, that does start with emailing Avolution support for licenses or for cloud accounts for that user. Now, once that user is then set up with a cloud account or with an installation of ABACUS Studio, that user can then access Studio. And from that point, they are Studio users. And a Studio user is going to be able to diagram, they're going to be able to work in data and catalogs and more. So no feature permissions are needed. There are additional feature permissions that we can add that correspond to specific features. However, there is no feature permission that enables just general ABACUS Studio use, because general ABACUS Studio use, again, editing diagrams, editing data and catalogs and so on, that is just what is enabled by simply being a Studio user, simply having access to Studio. So in this case, we're not going to enable any extra feature permissions. Now we do want to consider what model, create, read, update, delete permissions to enable. And this might be something where you can use one of those existing groups, or perhaps you find it easier to create a new group here. For someone like a solution architect such as Sam, it's a good idea to remove create or update permissions from objects that might be maintained in other source systems, or by other groups. So in this case, choosing between create or update is going to depend on whether everything about that object is managed in the source system or whether some of it is managed in Abacus. For example, with applications, let's say we're pulling our application data from ServiceNow. And in the case where everything about applications except for the connections to other components is managed in ServiceNow, then you can remove update permissions and Sam will still be able to connect things to applications. But there might be a different circumstance where applications are being pulled in from ServiceNow and most of the properties are coming from ServiceNow, but a subset is actually being managed in Abacus. That's where you would want to likely remove create permissions, um, removing create, and that's going to remove all of the other it's going to remove update and delete permissions as well. This component is still going to be something that Sam can connect to. Um, Sorry, I misspoke. So we can remove create permissions so that he still has update permissions to be able to update certain properties, but he's not going to be able to create new elements and confuse things with that source data. Keep in mind, we also have the option for creator can delete uncertain components. So that way a solution architect can maybe delete a component that they created themselves, but not mess with another user's work. This is definitely a situation where you want to take care when adding a user to multiple groups. Oftentimes, someone like a solution architect might seem like someone who would be in both, say, server team and application manager team. However, if you add that user to both of those groups, they're going to have the restrictions of both groups rather than the access of both groups. So this is one of those situations where you want to be really careful and see whether you need to create a new group that has specifically the permissions for these types of users. Also, as a studio user, Sam will need to install Abacus or log into the cloud account and then check out the collaboration server project. That's a step that enterprise users do not need to consider, but studio users do indeed need to go through that step of checking out the collaboration server project and being aware of how to commit and receive updates. Then Sam, the solution architect, is going to have the access needed. So of course, this does mean leveraging existing relationships. So being able to query as we're seeing here and continue to query on connected components. This is something that studio users specifically can do. And of course, in diagrams, that also means you could use freeform shapes to add in legends. And we also have the option in Studio to copy and paste diagrams. So those are all things that might come into play for certain types of users, but that are not going to come into play for anyone that we would be enabling as an enterprise modeler. Now, Sam is also likely going to be accessing Abacus Enterprise at a certain point. However, with the feature permissions that we have not enabled for Sam, so we haven't enabled anything extra, that just means that he's going to have the baseline permissions in Enterprise. So he's going to be a read-only user in Abacus Enterprise. Any create, read, update, delete model permissions that we set up in Studio for him are going to carry over. But for the most part, if we're restricting things like create, update, and delete, that's not going to have any bearing on the way that he works in Enterprise because he's going to be read-only already. So that is how we interact with Enterprise generally is just a standard Studio user. It's going to be just kind of that baseline level to Enterprise where it is just a read-only viewer. Being a Studio user does not enable additional access in Enterprise automatically. The other Studio user that we're looking at is Eric, the Enterprise Architect. He needs to be able to configure the meta model, administer users, and set up and run analysis, as well as set up and run syncs to other tools and be able to sync between architectures. So he's going to need a lot of more feature permissions enabled. So this starts the same way. We still have to email Avolution support for licenses or cloud accounts. And then we set up Eric as a user in the tool. Now, this is where he needs something in addition to the standard studio access. So we're going to need to add him to the following feature permissions group. So configurer to be able to configure the meta model, administrator to be able to administer users and permissions, as well as ServiceNow Sync to enable setting up ServiceNow Sync and running that, and simulators and algorithms to be able to do visual algorithms, and the out-of-the-box simulators such as financial and complexity, as well as architecture sync to enable syncing between architectures. And as with any studio user, he'll need to install Abacus or log into the cloud account and then check out the collaboration server project. And this is going to give him the access needed. So this includes things like modifying the meta model, adding component types, connection types, constraints, viewpoints, properties, etc., as well as running analysis, including setting up visual algorithms, as well as those out-of-the-box analysis options. And that's all with simulators and algorithms, that feature permission. And this also includes access to ServiceNow Sync, so that can be set up, as well as being able to sync between architectures. In addition, this user is going to be able to use the administrator feature, which includes being able to manage users in groups and set permissions. So most of what we've been talking about today does involve using the administrator feature, which enables access to this in Studio. Now, these feature permissions that we've enabled for Eric, these have implications on Studio as we've seen, but they also have implications for the way that he would be working in Enterprise. So in Enterprise, as a configurer, he has access to this configure menu, which you can note also includes the ability to set permissions on a dashboard. This configurer feature in Enterprise enables the configuration of portlets, creation of new dashboards, and so on. The administrator feature that we've also enabled for this user enables administrator options such as being able to force a sync or force a commit, as well as setting up things like single sign-on in Enterprise. So of course, all of this was a lot of information, and I encourage you to check out the resources that we have at support.evolutionsoftware.com under manage users, groups, and permissions. So this section does go through Abacus users, feature permissions, as well as model, create, read, update, delete. And we also have another webinar there about setting up enterprise modelers for success, which goes into a bit more detail about just the enterprise modeler side of things, as well as a comparison between enterprise modeler and a studio user. So thank you for listening today. Now we'll get into some Q&A. Before we get into the Q&A though, I do just want to mention that we have an upcoming webinar about data-driven enterprise modeling to drive business value. Of course, that ties in with a lot of topics today. So I highly encourage you to register for that. It's on the 26th of January, and you can see there's the QR code here on the slide as well. So with that, we can get into questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Corinna, there's one question so far, and I know you touched on this, but maybe just a quick refresher. But the question is, are studio users automatically enterprise editors too, or do they have to use up a separate license seat for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So studio users are not automatically editors. If you want them to be editors, they would be using up an additional editor seat out of your total. But keep in mind that anything an enterprise editor can do would a studio user can do in Studio. So they're able to edit properties, they're able to edit catalogs and so on. And of course, they can access that information directly from the diagrams in Studio as well. So they are not automatically set up with editor access in Enterprise. Studio user is going to be just a viewer, just a read-only user in Enterprise if you have not enabled any additional feature permissions for that studio user.
Thank you, Corinna. There's another question, and I think this one will be pretty easy for you to answer. But uh, one person said that they saw we have SSO for enterprise. Is there also SSO available for studio?
SSO can be set up for Studio when it is in the cloud. So for Studio in the cloud, it is set up in a bit of a different way. It requires more involvement from Avolution support, whereas Enterprise SSO can be set up more on the customer side of things. However, with Studio SSO, there isn't any concept of auto provisioning for Studio users. Um, that will not affect the ability to auto provision in enterprise. That's still going to work fine, but we aren't going to be automatically setting up studio users in the same way.
And another question is, how many administrators can you have?
Yeah, so you can have as many administrators as you need. So generally, you don't want to set up everyone as an administrator because that would be excessive. But on the studio side, you can set up all of your studio users as administrators if desired. Now, you can also enable the administrator feature for enterprise users who are not studio users. This is more rare, but it actually can be helpful when you're doing something like setting up single sign-on. You can set someone up to enable single sign-on and go through those steps who is not themselves a studio user. They're just an enterprise user where who you have enabled to do that by enabling that administrator feature permission for them. So there's not a cap on administrators.
Thank you. And piggybacking off that a little bit, would you have any recommendations for a deployment, roughly maybe 20 to 30 studio users, in terms of what your suggestions are for setting up the team?
Mhm. Yeah, so generally, just a small subset of those are going to be the configurers and administrators. Generally, we would say that that core group of configurer and administrator users would be up to five. And then beyond that, for setting those create, read, update, delete permissions, that really needs to be oriented around the way that those other users are going to be using Abacus, whether they're going to be using Abacus to focus on business analysis and process modeling or solution architecture. And so their model permissions should reflect that.
Awesome. Thank you, Corinna. There's one more question right now. If anybody has any additional questions, please submit them. Otherwise, this might be the last one. But Corinna, the last question we have right now is, do permission restrictions in Studio translate over to Abacus Enterprise users as well?
Yes, absolutely. So any permissions that are set in Studio do carry over to Enterprise. So for example, in Studio, you can set restrictions on being able to update a certain property, and any editors or modelers that are subject to that permission restriction are then not going to be able to edit that property in Enterprise. Also, even for viewers, we can set permissions such as not being able to view a certain architecture, and that's also going to carry over to enterprise as well.